The global silver market had been operating under the assumption that geopolitical tensions in the Middle East would remain contained to oil and gas sectors. That assumption was shattered when President Trump's new Iran sanctions package, unveiled during an emergency National Security Council briefing, targeted something far more critical than petroleum exports: Iran's control over strategic metal supply chains that connected directly to global silver production and distribution networks. Executive Order 14127, signed at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time, imposed unprecedented restrictions on any entity conducting business with Iranian-controlled mining operations, rare earth processing facilities, and strategic metal logistics networks throughout the Middle East. The order's scope extended far beyond Iran's borders to encompass regional partnerships that had been developing quietly for over 3 years, creating immediate supply chain disruption for industries that had never considered Middle Eastern geopolitics relevant to their operations. Within 18 hours, silver prices experienced violent volatility as automated trading systems struggled to process the implications of sanctions that affected not just Iranian silver exports, but the entire regional network of mining, refining, and transportation infrastructure that connected Middle Eastern strategic metals to global manufacturing supply chains. Price swings of 8 to 12 per ounce occurred in minutes as algorithms attempted to calculate supply disruption impact across interconnected markets. The crisis deepened when industry analysts recognized that Iran's strategic metal influence extended far beyond direct production. Through partnerships with regional allies and proxy organizations, Iranian entities controlled approximately 34% of Middle Eastern silver processing capacity and 67% of regional strategic metal logistics networks that served European, Asian, and American manufacturing companies. Trump's sanctions had effectively weaponized supply chains that most corporations had never realized were vulnerable to geopolitical disruption. But the most devastating revelation emerged from confidential intelligence briefings that indicated Iran had been systematically accumulating silver reserves and strategic metal stockpiles in preparation for exactly this scenario. Rather than being caught off guard by American sanctions, Iranian leadership appeared to have anticipated economic warfare and positioned themselves to leverage strategic material scarcity as a counterweapon against Western economic pressure. The silver market faced the recognition that Middle Eastern geopolitical stability was no longer a peripheral concern, but a central factor in global strategic material availability. Trump's Iran policy had inadvertently revealed the extent to which American manufacturing capability had become dependent on supply chains that adversarial governments could weaponize during periods of international tension. The strategic metal dimension of Trump-Iran confrontation had been developing beneath public awareness for over 5 years, as Iranian leadership recognized that their country's geological endowments provided leverage opportunities that extended far beyond traditional oil and gas export strategies. Iran controlled significant silver deposits, rare earth processing capabilities, and critical mineral reserves that American manufacturing companies had been sourcing without recognizing the geopolitical implications of their supply chain decisions. Iranian strategic planning had identified silver and related metals as potential economic weapons that could be deployed against Western sanctions through supply restriction, price manipulation, and strategic partnership with other resource-rich nations. The strategy was sophisticated and long-term, involving gradual accumulation of market influence through seemingly commercial arrangements that obscured political objectives. Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran had focused primarily on oil exports and financial system isolation. But Iranian counter-strategy had evolved towards strategic material leverage that could affect American manufacturing, defense production, and technological capabilities in ways that traditional oil embargoes could not achieve. Silver became central to this strategy because of its essential role in electronics, renewable energy, and defense applications that American industrial policy could not easily substitute or replace. The regional partnerships that Iran had developed included coordination with allied governments and proxy organizations that controlled additional strategic metal resources throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. These arrangements created network effects where sanctions against Iran would trigger supply disruption across multiple countries and resource categories simultaneously. American intelligence services had been monitoring Iranian strategic metal activities, but had underestimated the scope and sophistication of the network that Tehran had constructed. The intelligence gaps reflected broader analytical failures that treated resource access as purely commercial concern rather than potential national security vulnerability. Corporate supply chain managers at major American manufacturers had been purchasing silver and related materials through intermediary companies and trading networks without conducting adequate due diligence on ultimate source countries or potential geopolitical risks. The complexity of modern commodity markets had obscured the extent to which American industrial capability depended on materials that adversarial governments could restrict or weaponize. European allies had been developing similar dependencies on Middle Eastern strategic materials, while pursuing energy diversification strategies that reduced oil and gas imports from the region. The irony was that efforts to reduce traditional energy dependence had created new vulnerabilities around strategic materials that were potentially more difficult to address through alternative sourcing. Chinese strategic material policies had been coordinating with Iranian approaches through bilateral agreements and multilateral partnerships that increased Beijing's influence over global strategic metal markets while reducing Western access to alternative suppliers. The coordination represented convergence of authoritarian resource strategies that challenged Western economic dominance through material scarcity rather than military confrontation. American electronics manufacturers faced immediate crisis as Trump-aimed Iran sanctions disrupted silver supply chains that connected to production facilities throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Companies including Intel, Apple, and Tesla discovered that their silver procurement networks included Iranian-controlled entities that could no longer be accessed without violating federal sanctions, creating immediate material shortages for critical production processes. The disruption extended beyond direct Iranian sources to affect regional processing facilities and transportation networks that handled silver and strategic metals from multiple countries. Sanctions compliance required American companies to conduct comprehensive supply chain audits that revealed extensive dependencies on Middle Eastern infrastructure that had been previously invisible to corporate risk management systems. Defense contractors faced particular vulnerability as military electronics and weapon systems required silver components that met strict quality and security standards. Alternative suppliers outside the Middle East could not immediately provide equivalent materials with necessary certification and performance characteristics, creating potential delays for critical defense production programs. The crisis exposed fundamental weaknesses in American strategic material policy that had allowed essential manufacturing inputs to become dependent on supply chains controlled by adversarial governments. Industrial resilience required geographic diversification that American companies had not implemented due to cost optimization strategies that prioritized efficiency over security. Solar energy development faced immediate constraints as photovoltaic panel production required silver that was increasingly difficult to source outside Iranian-influenced supply networks. Renewable energy projects that were central to American climate policy encountered material availability problems that threatened timeline and cost assumptions underlying government environmental programs. Energy storage systems essential for renewable energy integration required silver components that alternative suppliers could not provide at scale necessary to support American infrastructure development goals. The Iran crisis had created strategic material bottlenecks that affected domestic energy policy implementation, regardless of political support or funding availability. Utility companies with major renewable energy investment programs faced potential project delays and cost increases that could affect their ability to meet state renewable portfolio standards and federal climate commitments. Energy transition policy had become hostage to Middle Eastern geopolitical stability through supply chain dependencies that policymakers had not anticipated. The crisis demonstrated how environmental objectives could be compromised by strategic material vulnerabilities that energy planning had not adequately addressed. American energy independence required not just domestic energy production, but control over materials essential for energy infrastructure, development, and maintenance. Silver prices experienced unprecedented volatility as markets attempted to price the potential magnitude and duration of Middle Eastern supply disruption. Automated trading algorithms generated erratic price movements as programmed parameters could not process geopolitical variables that had not been included in model assumptions about silver market stability. Precious metals, ETFs, and mining stocks experienced dramatic price swings as investors struggled to evaluate the impact of Iranian supply restrictions on global silver availability. Market volatility reflected uncertainty about whether alternative sources could compensate for Middle Eastern production and processing capacity that was being restricted by sanctions. Currency markets reflected broader investor concern about American economic vulnerability to strategic material disruption that could affect manufacturing competitiveness and technological capabilities. Dollar strength was pressured by recognition that American industrial capacity faced potential constraints from geopolitical tensions that monetary policy could not address. International commodity markets demonstrated increased correlation between Middle Eastern political developments and strategic material prices, indicating that geopolitical risk assessment would need to be integrated into investment strategies that had previously treated resource availability as purely commercial consideration. Geopolitical escalation. European allies faced pressure to choose between supporting American Iran sanctions and maintaining access to Middle Eastern strategic materials that were essential for European manufacturing and renewable energy development. The crisis tested alliance solidarity when economic interests diverged from political cooperation objectives. Chinese strategic material stockpiling accelerated as Beijing recognized opportunities to gain market share in silver and related metals, while Western access to Middle Eastern supplies was constrained by political tensions. China's resource strategy benefited from American-Iranian confrontation that reduced Western competitive position in strategic material markets. Regional Middle Eastern countries faced pressure to choose between Iranian partnership and American market access, creating diplomatic complications that extended beyond traditional oil and security relationships. Strategic materials had become tools of international influence that affected alliance structures and regional stability. International organizations, including the United Nations and World Trade Organization, faced challenges in addressing strategic material weaponization that operated through commercial mechanisms rather than traditional military or diplomatic pressure. Existing frameworks for international economic cooperation were inadequate for managing resource conflicts that combined commercial and security dimensions, defense and national security implications. American military readiness faced potential constraints as defense contractors struggled to maintain production schedules for weapon systems that required silver components subject to Iranian supply disruption. Military planning assumptions about material availability required immediate revision to account for geopolitical variables that had not been included in defense industrial base assessments. NATO alliance capabilities faced similar vulnerabilities as European member countries discovered that their defense industrial capacity depended on Middle Eastern strategic materials that could be restricted during periods of international tension. Alliance military cooperation required strategic material coordination that existing frameworks had not addressed. Strategic weapon systems, including missile guidance, radar equipment, and communication networks, relied on silver and related materials that adversarial governments could potentially restrict to degrade American military capabilities. National security required strategic material independence that current defense policy had not prioritized or funded adequately. Intelligence services faced challenges in monitoring and analyzing strategic material threats that combined commercial, technological, and security dimensions. Traditional intelligence frameworks were inadequate for addressing resource warfare that operated through market mechanisms rather than conventional military or diplomatic channels. The moment of irreversible transformation occurred when Iranian leadership responded to Trump's sanctions by formally activating the Strategic Material Defense Protocol, a previously classified policy framework that authorized systematic restriction of Iranian-controlled strategic metal exports to any country participating in economic warfare against the Islamic Republic. The protocol's implementation marked the beginning of resource-based international conflict that traditional diplomatic and military frameworks could not address. Iran's response was not limited to direct export restrictions, but encompassed coordination with allied governments and proxy organizations throughout the Middle East to create comprehensive strategic material embargoes that affected Western supply chains across multiple resource categories simultaneously. The coordinated response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Western manufacturing vulnerabilities and strategic material dependencies that Iranian intelligence services had been mapping for years. The regional strategic material embargo extended beyond silver to encompass rare earth elements, specialty metals, and processing capabilities that were essential for American defense production, renewable energy development, and advanced technology manufacturing. Iran had weaponized the entire Middle Eastern strategic material ecosystem rather than simply restricting individual resource exports. Trump administration officials faced the recognition that American economic warfare capabilities were constrained by strategic material dependencies that provided adversarial governments with equivalent leverage over American industrial capacity. Maximum pressure strategies required strategic material independence that American industrial policy had not developed and could not implement within timelines that crisis management demanded. Congressional emergency sessions convened to address strategic material vulnerabilities that threatened American manufacturing, defense production, and energy infrastructure development, but legislative responses required years of implementation, while Iranian restrictions created immediate supply constraints. Political solutions were inadequate for addressing resource dependencies that required industrial and technological capabilities that did not exist domestically. The crisis established precedent for strategic material warfare that could be applied by any resource-rich country facing American economic pressure. Iran had demonstrated that natural resource endowments could provide defensive capabilities against sanctions that traditional military deterrence could not offer. European allies recognized that their strategic material dependencies made them vulnerable to Middle Eastern resource restrictions, regardless of their political positions on Iranian nuclear development or regional security issues. Alliance solidarity was constrained by economic realities that political cooperation could not overcome. Chinese strategic material policies accelerated to take advantage of Western supply chain disruption that provided Beijing with opportunities to expand market influence, while American and European access to Middle Eastern resources remained constrained by political tensions that China did not face. 6 months after the Trump-Iran crisis escalated into strategic material warfare, global silver markets operated under permanent uncertainty about Middle Eastern supply availability that had fundamentally altered risk assessment and pricing mechanisms throughout precious metals and strategic material sectors. Price volatility had become structural rather than temporary, as geopolitical tensions created ongoing supply disruption possibilities. American manufacturing companies had been forced to develop alternative sourcing strategies and strategic material stockpiling programs that increased production costs, while reducing efficiency gains that global supply chain optimization had previously provided. Industrial competitiveness required geographic diversification that compromised cost advantages, but provided security against resource weaponization. The transformation had revealed that economic interdependence created mutual vulnerabilities that adversarial governments could exploit during political confrontations. Iranian strategic material leverage demonstrated that resource-rich countries possessed defensive capabilities against economic warfare that traditional military deterrence frameworks had not anticipated or addressed. Trump administration policies faced the recognition that maximum pressure strategies required strategic material independence that American industrial capacity could not provide within timelines that political pressure demanded. Economic warfare capabilities were constrained by resource dependencies that provided adversarial governments with equivalent leverage over American economic interests. Strategic material considerations had been permanently integrated into American foreign policy planning. As government agencies recognized that resource access affected national security, economic competitiveness, and alliance relationships in ways that traditional diplomatic and military factors did not encompass. Resource geography had become central to international relations rather than peripheral consideration. International commodity markets reflected permanent premium pricing for strategic materials as investors recognized that geopolitical stability was essential for supply chain security that market mechanisms alone could not guarantee. Resource availability required political relationships that commercial contracts could not ensure independently. The silver market had become proxy for broader strategic material vulnerabilities that affected every major economy, its industrial capabilities, and technological development potential. Precious metals pricing incorporated geopolitical risk assessment that reflected permanent uncertainty about resource access during international tensions. Iranian success in leveraging strategic material dependencies encouraged similar strategies among other resource-rich countries facing American economic pressure. Venezuela, Russia, and China developed coordinated resource restriction capabilities that provided collective leverage against Western economic dominance through material scarcity rather than military confrontation. The crisis had established new frameworks for international conflict that operated through resource control and supply chain disruption rather than traditional diplomatic or military pressure. Strategic material warfare had become a permanent feature of international relations that required new institutions and capabilities that existing governance structures could not provide. American strategic planning faced the recognition that national security required resource independence that globalized economy had eliminated through efficiency optimization that prioritized cost reduction over strategic autonomy. Economic competitiveness and national security had become contradictory objectives that required fundamental restructuring of industrial policy assumptions. The transformation was irreversible because it reflected geological and political realities that could not be changed through policy modification or technological innovation alone. Strategic material dependencies had become permanent constraints on American foreign policy flexibility that required acceptance of reduced leverage or massive industrial restructuring that would require decades to complete. Trump's Iran confrontation had inadvertently revealed the extent to which American power depended on global supply chains that adversarial governments could weaponize more effectively than traditional economic or military pressure could counter. The crisis marked the beginning of resource-based international competition that would define geopolitical relationships for generations.